This is going across all parts of English history and giving this comprehensive view, which hopefully people who've not had a particular interest in history, because it often gets bogged down in a lot of detail at particular points in history. This tries to sort of give a much broader overview, but tells the story. If you're in England, you need to know what is the history of England and why it's got to this position at this point in time. And it means that, you have a better sense of the ideas of the common law, the ideas of the institutions, the idea of freedom of speech, all these key liberties and important factors that make England an attractive place to live. It's attractive because of its inheritance. And people need to recognize what inheritance is and not lose it. Because it's easy to sort of criticize things that might have happened in the past without being sort of having a proper understanding of what it was like at that point in time. People acted in this way because of circumstances that existed at that point in time. You can't apply your current views to views that happened hundreds of years ago. It just doesn't make any sense.
What do you mean by identity?
Well, identity is strongly linked to history. And I think a useful way of making a connection to the past was through the research I did into family history. Genealogies are quite similar to national stories. They have a start, a beginning, a story over the ages, and it comes through then to the present day. So that to me is really what I was trying to capture in the book, making sure that people weren't just taking their history from the accepted narrative, that they did their own research, looked into historical events that maybe were associated with their ancestors, and from that they'd get a better sense of history and their own identity.
How do these forms of identity shift over time?
Okay, well, the values associated with identity, I don't think shift very much over time. The biggest shift, I think, in English history probably came after the Romans, when the Anglo-Saxons arrived, who formed the bulk of the English population over the next 1,500 years. The values of free speech, common law, have continued over that period. What has changed, though, is technology. And at different periods, there have been different technological advances that have meant that identities have sort of shifted to fit in with that. The obvious example of that would be industrialization, when people moved from an agricultural background into an industrial setting, and they then had to change their culture and way of living to accommodate that. Where there had been movements of people, they were actually very local movements. They went into nearby towns and cities during the Industrial Revolution from a catchment area of around about 20 miles. So there wasn't a huge movement of people throughout the huge social change that occurred during the Industrial Revolution. The biggest movement of people within England occurred in the early 1930s, in the Depression, when there were quite large numbers of people who moved from the north of England to the south. In fact, my grandparents moved at that point as well. They were all four of them were from the north of England.
How does English identity differ from British identity?
Well, that's a good question, because English identity and British identity have become quite conflated. And quite often people call themselves British and English interchangeably. I would argue that there is a difference. And there's a difference because Britain is not a nation in its own right. It's a collection of nations. It's a collection of 4 nations: the English, Scots, Welsh, and Irish. And they've come together over a long period of time at different times and for different reasons. So the different nations within the British Union are quite different in terms of their culture, their history, their religion, and their language. You know, different languages are still spoken in Wales. Gaelic's spoken in Scotland and Ireland. Religion is different as well. Anglicanism predominates in England. Scotland has its own national Presbyterian church. And obviously Ireland has, well, in the south of Ireland is predominantly Catholic, and Northern Ireland has a large number of Protestants. So this is a very different collection of nations that have come together under a political union. So England is quite culturally different from the other nations in the Union. As previously mentioned, the majority of the English arrived after the Roman occupation, the Anglos and Saxons, who arrived in the 5th century. And by the time of the 8th century, there was a sense of an English nation. In the early 10th century, 927, the first English king of all the Anglo-Saxons came into power. That was very different to the other kingdoms that existed in the British Isles at that time. And soon after the English state was first created back in 927, there was a massive battle which involved the other kingdoms of the British Isles against the new English state. The battle was Brunanburh, and it allegedly took place on or near the Wirral Peninsula in Cheshire. It resulted in a massive victory for the English forces. And at that point, England as a nation became cemented. The different regions and kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England had joined together over a period of about 200 years. Now they were one unified nation, possibly the earliest ever nation state in the world. So quite a different history, quite a different background to the other nations that were Gaelic, Celtic nations that remained separate until they joined the Union. So English identity has to some extent been lost as a consequence of its intermingling with British identity. And this can be traced back, I think, to the period around the Napoleonic Wars, when Britain became a sort of a major centralizing state. It had to, because of the war against Napoleon in Europe. So it meant that things like mobilization of troops, conscription, national taxation. In fact, income tax was introduced at that point in time. So all of these things sort of developed around the time of the Napoleonic Wars, and it created a sort of a sense of a British state and a sense of Britishness. It was helped by a number of sort of war heroes at the time. Let's say that. I mean, most notably Admiral Nelson, Horatio Nelson, famous for the Battle of Trafalgar. He was killed in the battle and given a state funeral. These are the trappings of creating a sort of a British myth, sort of a hero that people can coalesce around. Wellington, at the Battle of Waterloo, similarly had an idea of a hero built around him. And these ideas of British heroes then throughout the Victorian period, the whole 19th century, become quite prevalent. So you have, for example, Dr. Livingstone in his exploration of Africa becomes a national hero. There are just General Gordon in Africa as well as another national hero. There's like heroes emerge. The Battle of Balaclava in the Crimea War, the Charge of the Light Brigade. These are creating these sort of national myths, and they're British ones. And everybody from around the British Isles, all the nations of the British Isles, all buy into this as well. The Scots and the Irish and the Welsh see these national successes, particularly military ones, as sort of part of the British identity and part of this idea of Britishness, probably reaches its peak just before the First World War. You can point to the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria in 1897, which is a huge celebration across Britain that involved large numbers of people from across the whole of the British Empire. It was the first time that these things were filmed. The processions appeared in cinemas around the country. It was a major national event. Having said that, there was also a revival of Englishness, particularly as a consequence of the industrialisation that was going on in the Victorian period. And this was a way of trying to re-engage people with their traditions at a time when the whole society was in flux. So lots of things started to re-emerge then. There was a lot more written about Anglo-Saxon heroes like Alfred the Great, Hereward the Wake. These became national figures, and they became English figures that were like re-emerged from the past. Robin Hood and the stories of Robin Hood and the stories of King Arthur, they also gained much more prominence at this time. This is all part of a sort of a sense of trying to bring a stability and a sense of a long past which could be held onto at a point in time when society was going through a huge transformational stage. With the First World War, this created another sense of Britain coming together. Huge sacrifices were made. This again helped boost the notion of a British state. Everybody was again taking part in an action that had sort of equal consequences around the different parts of the Union. And Scots, Irishmen, Welshmen, they're all there on the Western Front, and they all suffered. So this all brings the idea of a British nation to the fore again, and it sort of just creates a sort of a sense that the Englishness is now really taking a bit of a back seat during this process. It continues after the First World War. There are obviously lots of remembrance ceremonies, and people are recognising the sacrifices that people made in that war. That helps give a sense of Britishness. But also new institutions started to develop, particularly the BBC, which became a national broadcaster across the whole of the British Isles. It was a British institution, and it sort of underpinned a lot of this idea of having a British state under which there are different nations. So this idea continues through the interwar period, and of course through the Second World War as well. There's yet another war, yet another period of sacrifice. This time, people at home are, impacted through mass bombings. So, I mean, just to put this into perspective, I think it's worth sort of remembering that close on 1 million British soldiers died in the First World War in the trenches. In the Second World War, the casualty levels were closer to 500,000. But there were a large number of British casualties, civilian casualties, 70,000 of them through bombings. Millions of people lost their homes and were massively traumatized in those events. So all of these things, I think, are adding to this experience of the nation, if you like, is adding to this idea of a British nation. And, it's forged to a large extent in war, going back to the Napoleonic Wars, then the First World War, then the Second World War. So I'd like as many people as possible to read this book, because I think it's an important contribution to the debate around English identity and where the nation is going, how people understand their history, and particularly younger people who I think are sort of losing touch with the historic events and important sacrifices that our ancestors have made over many centuries. And I think if people can get in touch with their own backgrounds and ancestors and get a real feeling for history, historical events that maybe their families have been associated with, then I think people will have a much stronger identity and a more confident approach to where Britain and England is today and where it's going.